Yeah, yeah. Get your ass up and hurry up.
Would you like drugs with him?
Well, we're joined on the line by Debby Anglesey, and she has a book which is called Battling the MSG Myth, a survival guide and cookbook. Of course, MSG stands for monosodium glutamate, and we welcome her to the program. Hello to you, Debbie.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, speaking to us in Washington State.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, where it's obviously several hours earlier. Anyway, thank you very much for coming on the line. First of all, Debbie, before we get into all of the news about MSG, just a little bit about you and your history, because you suffered for many years from all sorts of strange symptoms which you couldn't, and seeing doctors, nobody could quite diagnose what was wrong.
Oh, yes. I began in 1974, right after my third child was born. And it started with attacks to my chest. I couldn't breathe. It was very painful to breathe. And so I went for a battery of tests, and nothing was discovered. My heart was strong. I didn't have asthma. Although later, some other doctor diagnosed it as asthma, and I had shots for 21 years, which I didn't need, I found out. And then I progressively got worse. I would have terrible migraine headaches, and then I would have terrible digestive problems and irritable bowel syndrome, acid reflux, they would call it today, which is so prevalent. There's pills advertised on our television every day for acid reflux. And I believe I would have been diagnosed with what they call fibromyalgia today, but there was no such thing, really, back in the 70s. And so for many years, until 1995, I was very ill, and it was a downhill spiral. I just was so ill, tired, chronic fatigue all the time, achy joints, vertigo. And finally, I discovered what it was in 1995. And once I eliminated MSG and aspartame, which works on the same brain receptors as MSG, I became well.
But you were ill for some 20 years.
21 years.
And it makes you wonder how many other people there are who are suffering from these undiagnosed symptoms.
Millions. I would guesstimate at millions. It wasn't until my son, who was 20 at the time, began to show the same symptoms that I started doing some research. I believe I would have just continued on the way I was and accepted the doctor's diagnoses for me, several doctors. I went to so many different doctors, and they all had their own diagnosis. And then I would try the pills, and I would try all kinds of things, different diets, thinking it was just allergies of some sort. But this is a true toxin. And MSG, just like aspartame, they are powerful brain-altering substances.
And they are poisonous, there's no doubt.
They are poisonous. They are true drugs. They are toxic.
And they are put in so many of our everyday foods and meals that we would not believe it. Well, I mean, I must say, first of all, and just putting it out there to the listeners, I'm a complete convert, and you don't need to do too much to convince me, because I know that I'm one of these sensitive people myself. I had a Chinese meal that had MSG in it, although I asked for them to take it out, and the symptoms I had were just completely bizarre. My face was completely swollen. I woke up in the morning, my eyes were puffy. Well, I woke up, I didn't sleep, but, it just felt terrible. And I was speaking to a friend a short while ago, and she said that in the United States this was actually called, Chinese food syndrome almost, that it was something that was so known to be in Chinese food that, people almost recognized it as such.
That's right. And what's so misleading, though, is that the average person, when they call it Chinese, food syndrome, they think that the main problem is Chinese food, and that they're only going to react when they go to a restaurant, like you did. But the problem is that now it's hidden in our processed food. It is everywhere. And the average person would not realize that hydrolyzed protein, autolyzed yeast extract, there are 75 different aliases for glutamate-containing additives. And it can be anywhere from 60% to 12% to 80%. That contain glutamate, these substances, but they don't have to label it as monosodium glutamate on the label. And so people don't realize they're getting an immense amount every single day in their typical American diet. And now we hear from people all over the world. We send our books everywhere on the globe. And so the problem is it's a fast-growing epidemic. People are adding it more and more. And as people become more affluent in more nations like in China, we hear all the time, well, how come the Chinese people don't get sick? Well, there are epidemics in China now. Diabetes is an epidemic in Asia. Obesity is a terrible problem now in China. It says in one of these articles that I read, it was MSNBC News, and this was August 2006, that nearly 1 in every 5 of China's more than 1.3 billion people are overweight or obese, and the problem is getting worse among children. So this is a growing epidemic worldwide.
So ironically, although you might be feeling very unwell with this allergy sort of syndrome going on inside your body and having all these awful symptoms that you mentioned of different digestive problems, the irony of the thing is that you're also getting fatter. I mean, it is something that causes obesity too, this MSG.
That is so true. MSG is an endocrine disruptor, and it's also an inflammatory agent. And this has been proven in lab tests since the 1970s. And what happens with obesity is that MSG triggers an insulin, adrenaline, fat storage, food craving response in our brains. And this depletes our serotonin levels, which triggers headaches, depression, fatigue, and it leads to more food cravings. So we feel so rotten, so what we do is we reach for the same foods that got us into that situation in the first place.
So it's also addictive.
It's very addictive. It tastes so much better because MSG, basically, it tricks your brain into perceiving salty, and sweet sensations as opposed to bitter and sour. And so that is why the food factories use it. They know that they can add perhaps not the best ingredients for their processed food item, but by adding, and they also add preservatives and chemicals, and they know that MSG is going to cover these flavors and make it much more palatable.
So it's sort of labeled euphemistically something like a flavor enhancer, isn't it?
That's what it is.
That's what they call it. Now, does it have a natural state? I mean, is it something that grows, or is it something that's built in or put together in a laboratory?
Well, it is. MSG is actually a factory-created flavor enhancer. It's comprised of sodium and glutamic acid. Now, glutamic acid is an amino acid, and it's normally found in its natural form, bound to other proteins in plants and animals naturally. That's naturally occurring bound glutamate or glutamic acid. It's a bound form, and this is harmless. And our bodies slowly digest the glutamate in a cob of corn, perhaps, or a tomato or mushrooms. We slowly digest it and slowly utilize it. So, and our brains eventually use it as a neurotransmitter, which is very important. But in its isolated free form that's made in the factory, called MSG, it becomes dangerous. We're getting far too much of it in our processed foods. And when it was first added to our foods in the late 40s, the average person ingested 12 grams, approximately. Today, that number is 400 grams a year. And that amount keeps growing as we come to rely more and more on these factory-made foods.
Imagine how much money they've spent trying to silence good people who have put their lives on the line to fight for change.
Here's your drug, sir. Have a nice day.